I see it's not as empty as before. That's very, very good, because what you now will hear has nothing to do with engineering and very, very small things to do with large vessels. What I will present is economics, and I will put a special focus on patterns of international trade, with an overview of recent developments and potential projections. I mean, it is not our forecast, it is not what we project for the future. It's basically what economic literature and especially the WTO thinks, and I think it will give you and me and us a good basis, a good ground for discussions about future development, also in shipping and especially also in vessel sizes. Okay, you can see this picture. That's when I started to prepare this presentation and this talk. What I found absolutely amazing is the tremendous increase in trade over the last 10 and 20 years. I mean, we know all that, but if you take really a look on the economic figures behind it, you see that despite the economic crisis in 2008, you see this little drop there. International trade is a big success. Exports and imports have grown tremendously. And what I find especially interesting, that it's not just a growth story for, let's say, OECD or developed countries. It is also a growth story for, let's say, developing or transition countries, especially, and I'm not I think necessary to say, but especially for China. World trade increased dramatically. What we also see is that trade growth continues to outpace GDP growth. That means that trade increased much more than GDP. What is that? Why is that so? Well, we can identify that trade is, let's say, a driver and also a foundation for GDP growth, making a smaller part of it. But that's an interesting aspect, that trade growth is larger than GDP growth, and this holds true for nearly every region of the planet. What we also see is that, I just mentioned it, that in the last decade, it was not the classical, let's say, trading countries like the US or Germany or Japan who made the pace. It was developing countries. And you see that especially Eastern and Southern Eastern Asian countries, they benefit from this increase, and they were kind of also the drivers behind this the success. What we see is an on average increase of 7% for the last 10 years, and that is really a boom, so to say. And we see that there are differences in export regions. What we also can identify from an economic angle, from an economic point of view, is that that this increase in trade also shows, let's say, what we call the division of labor, that we use comparative advantages from different regions of the world to produce goods, to produce services, and then trade it bilaterally, trilaterally, or even multilaterally from region to region. What we also see is that developing countries show faster import over export growth. That means that they consume more and more, which is good for the exporting countries, but might, lead to problems in these developing countries. That depends on the production structure and on also the import structure of these countries. When we differentiate the trends in the recent past, we can identify, basically two sectors or two aspects, two dimensions, which can be differentiated. The first one is the regional dimension. And what can we see? What have we seen can we learn from the last years? World trade concentrated on Europe, North America, and East Asia, especially China. That's interesting because I just mentioned that this development also, or the trade development also touches developing countries, but it seems that at least for the last 10 years, Africa, for instance, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, was not part of the story. It was basically Southeast Asia and basically China. China gained importance. I just mentioned one figure here. It increased its market share, global market share in trade or in exports by 5 percentage points. I mean, it doesn't sound that much, 5 percentage points. But that means that China increased its world market share from 5 to 10%. So it took 10% of the overall trade of the world. It's just China, and the growth is 100% in 10 years, which is tremendous and shows the, let's say, economic success of People's Republic of China. Yeah, well, on the other hand, what can we also differentiate? It's the product dimension. When we focus on the trade pattern and on the, let's say, structure of imports and exports for different countries, we see that OECD countries are rather, let's say, diversified. They have a large portfolio of different goods and services they import, and they usually have a large portfolio of different goods and services they export. And this is not all. This does not hold true for developing countries. With some developing countries, we have also this pattern, but with the majority, they are specialized exporters. And a lot of them are specialized exporters on two kinds of goods. Either it's food, that's when they are from Latin America, or it's natural resources, that's when they are from Africa or other parts of the world. So we see that they are kind of specialized, but this specialization is also putting them on a special kind of risk. So in the development where global demand for the goods they supply probably drops for whatever reasons, high prices or taxes or whatever, that will put these countries under an export risk and makes them much more vulnerable to economic shocks than compared to, for instance, OECD countries. We also see that trade with primary products, I mean, that's basically natural resources, coal, gas, oil, and so on. Commodities increased over the years. Well, that has basically two reasons. One is an increasing demand, also in developing countries, for these goods, and by that, increasing prices and new discoveries. I mean, you have heard about all the shale oil and new gas and new coal deployments of origins which have been found in the last years. I already mentioned the surplus region in terms of food exports, that's Latin America. On the other hand, also interesting, I think, is that Western Asia and North Africa are large net food importers, so they depend on food imports. I mean, if you take a global economic, global political perspective, you see that also that can increase some kind of risks. What we also see is that trade and intermediates increased dramatically. So what is that from an economic perspective? Again, the division of labor. So we see that countries who produce primary goods, they export it, they import intermediates, probably even export it again, or other countries, they trade intermediates to, again, develop further and better products and services. Also a good indicator for, let's say, a division of labor and a specialization also in terms of trade. What are the trading partners of the EU? I mean, let's put for a second the focus on Europe. What we see is that also in the last 10 years, the US are the dominant partner, the most important trading partner for the EU, especially because they buy lots of our products. What they also do, they sell quite a lot, but you know that the balance is, well, largely negative for the US. Also putting us in Europe under a little economic pressure or risk. What is interesting from a development perspective is that China, you know that, has gained lots of importance for the EU as a trading partner, both in terms of imports and in terms of exports. And what we also see is, I mean, that is for the year 2012, I think, or 2013, that Russia at that time was also a strong exporter of certain goods. I mean, you know that's energy basically, oil and gas, and comparably lower importers, so they have a positive trading balance. What we can say, to put it all together, is that EU have a trade deficit with most of the emerging economies because they import quite a lot of natural resources, except for Brazil, where the situation is a little different. Okay, that's recent developments. I mean, that's probably what you have already known, but I think especially the slope of the growth rate is absolutely tremendous. And I would like to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes on potential developments in the future. We could call it projections, we could call it scenarios, and it should give you an indication for the importance of future trade. What most of the sources state is that trade will continue to be important and to be more dynamic than GDP growth also in future. So this pattern, this structure we have already identified will hold also for the future. Who might be, let's say, the winner of this future development? Potentially developing countries. They should face the strongest increase in exports. That's what most of the predictions say, and that has, again, consequences in an international trade. The first consequence is that demand for intermediates, so not, let's say, the last goods, but manufacturing goods and primary products, will increase. So we'll have, again, an increase in this division of labor I already mentioned. Then we'll see that the global share of the global market share of trade in South-South, that means from developing to developing countries, will rise mainly at the expense of the North-North trade. So let's say the East Asian and African trade will increase in importance, while the US-EU trade might decrease, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. That means that the South trade will be kind of the winner of this global game. Again, when you see literature of international trade, there's one aspect we should also discuss and mention, and that is that protectionist or tax and aspects related to that risks are quite present, especially in India and China in terms of food product or farm product imports. That could be a major challenge also for international trade. But also in Europe, we see in some sectors this idea of protectionism again. And if you follow the discussion about TTIP in Europe, we see that also, let's say, large fractions of the society are not pro-trading, at least not in any dimension. Okay, the probably most prominent figures I will present now are from the WTO, and I think also that this is kind of striking. It struck me because the assumptions are in two scenarios. WTO choose on the one scenario, which is an optimistic, a high scenario, a rather optimistic view on world GDP development for the next 20 years. But the results in terms of global trade would be absolutely amazing. On the other hand, even if GDP will not increase that much in a pessimistic or low scenario, global trade will also play a major role in the future. So what is the basic results? Well, in the high scenario, that means that, well, it assumes basically that GDP is going to increase by roughly 150% in the next 20 years, which is optimistic, but has been seen in mankind history. Trade will grow from 10K billion US dollars, or 10,000 billion US dollars in the year 2012 to approximately 46,000 billion dollars. I mean, that's an increase by 350% on a trade level, which has already been quite high. Yeah, and who will benefit from that? There's one elephant in the room, and that will be China, which might expand its international trading market share from roughly 15% to 24%. So that's the optimistic scenario. Basically, the entire world will participate in this, and China will especially. What could happen if this optimistic scenario does not hold? Well, that's the different story then. Exports of goods will not grow that much, rather by 1% a year, so not very much. China and developing countries would get under stress. They would, lose market shares. Also, in absolute terms, the developed countries would, but not to that extent. So, I mean, this is, I think, the situation we should discuss in future. We know that trade will be of vital interest of the entire world. We know that it will play a very important role, but we can also say that the future developments in trade is definitely based on the development of global economic growth. And I would love to discuss the consequences also for the shipping sector with you just in a few minutes. Thank you very much.